Studies show that people who are experiencing some kind of chronic pain or suffering are 4 times more likely to experience the symptoms of depression and 2 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts or attempts. Now, for some added fun, for those of you who have been following this series, people who have fibromyalgia are about double that. And I say that's fun because that is what I have been diagnosed with. So these numbers are kind of serious. It's one thing to say, wow, it must be really hard to suffer. It must be really difficult. That must be challenging. It's another to have a lot of data showing that it affects people on a daily, moment-by-moment level, to the degree that people are even twice as likely to want to end their suffering because it can be so challenging. Now, in this episode, I'm going to be honest about the reality that many people face. I'm going to speak openly about my depression and depression in general, suicidal thoughts, and how it relates to suffering. I want to make it clear, I'm not a licensed counselor or medical professional. I am discussing this and sharing all of this from a biblical perspective and not offering professional advice. Now, if this conversation is difficult or overwhelming as you're listening to it, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to a pastor or a mature believer that you trust. I'll also include some links down in the show notes for ways that you can connect with somebody if you don't have immediate access in your home or in your local church body. And please just remember that while pain and suffering can feel very isolating, God doesn't want you to go through this alone. So as is typical in this series, I'm going to start off by sharing my own experience with the topic and how my over 10 years of walking through chronic pain and suffering has given me a perspective on this. This topic, just looking at my show notes, is going to be longer than a typical episode, which at this point, no one's probably surprised, but my plan is to break this into 2 parts. The first part is going to be just sharing my own experience with depression and suicidal thoughts, especially over the last 10 years. Dig into getting a biblical perspective on those things, trying to kind of cut through a lot of the more modern secular understandings and assumptions that we can make about it. And then in the next episode, I will get into a bit more of the practicals on how to respond when we or people around us are experiencing depression or suicidal thoughts. Now, if you're on YouTube, you might notice there's no video to this. If you would like to listen to this without the interruption of annoying ads, just make sure you check out the links down below and you can actually find a link to my podcast. Now, as far as my own experience with depression as it relates to suffering, this was not something that was new to me when my suffering began. I'd actually already struggled with depression and suicide attempts, suicidal thoughts for about 20 years before this whole thing started. I've discussed it in depth before, so I'm not going to get too into the nitty-gritty, but I actually have a fairly thorough series on my blog and on my podcast called Christians and Psychology, and I will link that down below if you want to get a little more into what all of that looked like outside of all of this. But one thing I've learned about myself is that I respond to difficulties with depression. And as we will see in the next part where we talk about a biblical perspective on depression, that makes sense. But unlike some of these other things that I've talked about in this series, this wasn't something that hit me out of nowhere, but it was something that really intensified and highlighted some issues I was having, but it also served as a good signal for what I was putting my hope in during these trials. So just to kind of try to quickly run you through where what the things that were going on where I was responding to it with depression and things like that. So as I've shared in the past, I got hurt. I tore a muscle in my shoulder that kind of led to this lifelong thing of what the doctors tell me is fibromyalgia, where effectively I am in almost constant nonstop pain. It is rare for me not to have some degree of pain. I've shared in the past that if you look at the 1 to 10 pain chart that they'll use in hospitals, a normal for me is at about a 4 on that pain chart. And so when this first happened, though, I've over the last 10 years grown accustomed to how that level of pain feels. But when this all first started, I could not get used to it. It was incredibly overwhelming. There was times it's like, I don't know how I can, stand any worse. And that was funny looking back, because there are days where I just pine for when I hurt in the way that I did, because year by year it just gets worse. But as this pain syndrome or whatever was setting in, at the time I was starting to teach at my church, teaching a theology class. That is something that became very difficult for me to do, to the point that I basically just had to stop doing it, because I just could not be reliable in feeling up to getting up and moving and focusing. And so that just really discouraged me. I felt like an absolute failure for being unable to do this thing that I thought God wanted me to do. I thought he had equipped me and kind of called me to do. With that, I also struggled to just attend church in general, which brought a lot of shame with it and embarrassment and discouragement, because I wanted to be around the people of God, but just didn't feel like I could get up and, drive in the car and go through that pain and, be able to function. I got to the point where I was unable to work anymore because, again, everything was incredibly overwhelming. I couldn't play with my kids very much, which was very frustrating as a dad, especially because my kids were at that age where they really like to wrestle and have me, pick them up and throw them on the bed. And so more and more, I kept having to say, no, kids, I can't. Daddy can't do it. And so that felt terrible. I was struggling to take part in my hobbies, and so even things that would normally have brought me enjoyment, I just couldn't do because they were somewhat physical in nature, not like sports or anything, but playing games and things like that. I couldn't reach across tables, and so I had to shut down a lot of those things. I started getting a lot of pain in my hands, and I didn't quite know if it was okay or not, and so I couldn't play things like video games as much. Intimacy with my wife became difficult, which was frustrating and embarrassing as a guy, and so that kind of threatened my identity there. Things like house projects started falling apart around me as I wasn't able to keep up with the things that my house needed. My wife had to take over mowing for me because the vibrations and pushing the mower was just too much, and so I had to rely on her to take care of that for me. Overall, I just felt a lot of shame and just having to depend on others to take me places, to help me with my kids, just a lot of having to ask for help or be frustrated because people would offer help, even though I should have said yes. In my pride and arrogance, I refused, but then I failed to do those things on my own anyway. Physically, I was really struggling to sleep more and more. I was getting a scant few hours of sleep every night, and that led to a lot of genuine physical fatigue because that's what happens when you don't sleep. On top of that, one of the common symptoms of fibromyalgia is being fatigued even beyond just a lack of sleep. It's just an absolute drain on my body and on my mind as well. And so on top of being physically exhausted, my brain was and still struggles with fogginess and being able to focus well and think clearly. And especially at that time, I could kind of feel some of my mental faculties slipping from me, where once I could think deeply and long and intricately about things, I started struggling to keep ideas together at times. And so as someone who is not a sports star, is not super outdoorsy, my mind was something that I treasured, and that was a thing that I enjoyed exercising, and that was also becoming difficult. I became more isolated from people. part of that was mandatory because I felt like I could not go out places. But then as all this stuff started happening and getting more frustrating, I started self-imposing isolation where I didn't want to be around people. I didn't want to invite them over or reach out or respond to their invitations to come and visit me. And so that just became a vicious cycle. Spiritually, I've shared in the past, I don't need to go too much into that, but I very much felt, though, like God was distant. I remember sometimes I would just sit there and just be like, I've always questioned how people could wonder where God is, but now I get it. I started understanding how it felt to feel like God had abandoned me, forgotten about me, that he was real, and I felt like he loved me, but he was almost like a distant parent, it felt like at that time. As far as putting my hope in things, I had, over the course of a year, exhausted a lot of tests and different treatments and stuff. I went to Mayo Clinic thinking, okay, well, this is the place that you go to get answers. And so we ran through the tests and all that, and they kind of looked at all the treatments I'd done, and Mayo Clinic kind of said, there's really nothing more that we can offer you. And so that was frustrating because I felt like whatever this biological thing was, even modern medicine couldn't offer me any hope. And so as time went on, year after year, I started realizing there is no relief in the sight. This was going to be my life for as long as my life went, as far as I could tell. And honestly, I had no hope. Everything that I had trusted in and relied on, everything that brought me happiness, everything that kind of told me who I was as a man, as a Christian, all these things that I was hoping would help me out and bring relief, nothing was doing it. And so all these plans I had for my life were slipping away, and all I was left with was suffering and being a burden to my family, and this wasn't what I wanted. And again, I say, it wasn't even just this is a temporary thing. For all the available data that there was on fibromyalgia, which in and of itself is frustrating because I think I've shared before, you can't even medically test for fibromyalgia. They just listen to your symptoms, and it's like, well, you share a lot of symptoms with these other people, so we're just going to kind of give you this thing. To where who knows what's actually wrong with me and what's wrong with other people. We may not all even have the same problem. It just presents similarly. And so I was like, okay, this is my life. I'm stuck living a life of pain and suffering and isolation and failure. And so I got more and more depressed. The more these things happened, the more everything around me was failing me, the more hopeless I became, the more filled with sorrow I was. I felt numb. I felt distant and detached from my life. And, saying this carefully, at that time, I started having thoughts of suicide. And again, this was not a first for me. I'd had a history of it before. And I don't want to get specific on it because I don't want to lead anyone into temptation or to encourage them to think similarly. But to summarize it, it felt like a way out. This life wasn't getting any better, and it just felt like, at the time, my only answer was to find relief on my own terms and to find happiness on my own terms. And it was tempting because I felt like that bad action and the pain that I would cause my family and stuff might actually outweigh the good of me feeling better and me getting relief from my difficulties. And so that is kind of what I went through and I experienced. That was the context of my depression at that time. Was nothing was working. There was nothing good that I could really see in my life. Now, that's not to say I didn't have good things in my life. My wife was amazing. My kids really stepped up. I had a lot of people in my church family being very loving and patient, but that didn't change how I was feeling and how I was responding to it. Those people could have made things worse, I suppose, but it was a really hard time in my life, and it lasted for years. And so I had to really work through what is this, how do I answer this depression? How should I think about this? These thoughts of suicide, I would never do it, but that option was there. And so that is kind of where I was for a while. And I'll probably talk more about this next episode, but to be honest, for people who are kind of hoping, this guy can just tell me the right thing, or I can find the right Bible verse and everything might be fixed. As we're going to discuss with understanding depression biblically, I still struggle with depression. I still have struggled with thoughts of suicide. But there's a reason for that. And when I have those thoughts, when I have those feelings come up, what I'm going to discuss has helped me to understand it, because I realize what those things are and where they come from. And it's my warning light to pay attention, because there's something wrong inside me. And my problem isn't the depression. But we'll get into that. But I just want to kind of say from the outset, I want to set realistic expectations here. I'm not going to be able to fix your depression. Lord willing, he may remove it from you. I've seen God do great work in how my depression works, but again, you'll see why as we talk, why it's not always a permanent fix for everybody, and why, to a degree, that's okay, because our depression can actually be a useful tool in our lives. So I'm going to move on now. We're going to discuss depression in kind of a broad sense. Now, I know that this series is very much focused on chronic pain and suffering, but if we're honest, depression is very much a common human experience. And so my focus, and it's fitting into how we respond through pain and suffering, because again, if you are going through it, whether it's a few weeks, a few months, a lifelong thing, you are, statistically speaking, 4 times as likely to experience the symptoms of depression. But I'm not going to just keep reiterating, chronic pain, chronic suffering, We're just going to get kind of a good, broad, biblically faithful understanding of depression. And then you can apply that to yourself if you're going through chronic pain and suffering, help others walk through it. But even if it's not related to suffering, nothing I'm going to say is really going to change, because depression itself is 100% not unique to someone just suffering from something especially difficult. So moving on to a biblical understanding of depression. For sake of time, I am not going to get into the difference between a secular understanding and what God reveals about how to think about depression. I have, as I said, a very lengthy explanation of how I understand these two different things in my series called Christians and Psychology, again, linked below. But if my explanation and how I am discussing depression seems different from what you've been told or how you've been trained to think about it or experience it, I'll just give a really, really broad, quick overview. Basically, secular psychologists, I'll say from the outright, they mean well. No one gets into psychology with the intent to be malicious. But the problem is that they're not working from a complete worldview, because they're not working from a biblical worldview. And so therefore, secular psychologists, for all the data that they can look at, right, like they can look at people's experiences and feelings, they can see the same things we see, but how they interpret it is based on their belief system. And because they have a flawed, arguably at times anti-God belief system, they can't treat the whole person. They can't accurately and fully and rightly identify what's going on in a person, because they don't believe in a spiritual component to the person. And so even Christians who utilize psychology and say, well, we believe that psychology is legitimate, we just need to, reflavor it or reinterpret it or add to it with the Bible. Ultimately, the problem they run into is very similar, in that they are starting with a flawed interpretation of people, and all they can do is then submit their application or their treatment underneath the authority of secular psychology. And so, unfortunately, even people who try to integrate psychology and Christianity can't do a full and complete job, because they're not starting with a biblical interpretation. They're starting with a secular interpretation and then getting their treatment options from that. So all that to say, again, that's a quick flyby overview, but that is why how I'm going to talk about depression is probably going to be different from how you may have thought about it or heard about it, even from Christians. And so I'm not trying to be controversial or combative, but if you're going to stick with me, you're going to see why thinking about depression biblically is going to give us a much different perspective and outlook of the whole thing, which I believe actually gives us true and genuine hope, because it puts our hope in the right things. It's not medicine. It's not even feeling better. So let's get into it. So what is it that causes depression? What is this whole depression thing about? So one thing that is really helpful to remember as we start this discussion is that depression isn't a single entity. A lot of times we think, I am experiencing depression in the same way I am experiencing a cough, or I'm experiencing a stubbed toe or something like that. We think that depression is just this singular thing, and if we just use the word, it accurately explains what's happening. But really, depression is a collection of feelings and experiences that get kind of wrapped up into a single label. And so, to prove my point, if you are someone who is experiencing depression, or if you're talking to someone experiencing depression, and let's pretend the word didn't exist, and you told someone, tell me how you're feeling, tell me what you're experiencing. Well, suddenly, someone who might otherwise say they are depressed with a single word might give you very different answers from 5 other people who would use that same label. You might have one person who says they're struggling with hopelessness, another who says they just feel this deep despair, another feels constant sorrow, another might feel this deep emptiness and detachment from life, or it might be just a lack of joy, or it might be that everything just seems kind of dark and pointless and frustrating. And you could go on and probably get a lot of different explanations, and you could even add experiences on there. Some people may or may not find joy in simple activities. Some may or may not struggle to just take care of simple hygiene and eating and things like that. So I think it's valuable to try to be specific when we are actually engaging with depression, either in ourselves or others, because it lets us get at the specific issues behind those feelings a lot easier. So in this episode and in the next one, I'm going to use the term depression, but understand that I'm talking about those individual feelings and experiences that we might attach to it, because while the feelings might be different, ultimately how we're going to think about depression, I think we can just use the term, because the way we think about it, the way we deal with it, and what biblical passages we use to guide us are going to be basically similar almost no matter what. So that being said, what causes depression? What's the deal with depression? I'm going to say that while depression feels like the worst thing and the big issue, for most people, depression is rarely the actual issue. Depression is usually the product of something else. Now that might seem insane, because I am feeling hopeless. I am feeling this deep despair. This is my greatest problem. But think about depression in the same way you might think about pain from an infection. Now, that pain that you're feeling, that throbbing, that burning, that is obvious. That is, to your experience as the individual going through it, that is the worst thing that you are experiencing in that moment. That is your true problem. And so your thought is, I want relief from this pain. But what's the real issue? The real issue is what is causing that pain. And so while, yes, there can be value in wanting to treat the pain and reduce that pain, and we'll talk about that in the next episode, ultimately, if all we're doing is treating symptoms and not getting at that deep infection, it's just going to be worse. And while we might be able to suppress the pain, that infection is going to pop up in other ways. And so we might be able to treat how that's popping up and those unpleasant symptoms. But ultimately, if we're not getting at that root thing, then what was originally just causing some mild discomfort may eventually kill us. And so, as I said, with my own depression and how I want us to think about it is I want us to realize that depression isn't the biggest thing, but instead depression is showing us that there is something deeply wrong. And it's not, unlike an infection, it's not something that is physically wrong with us for the most part. I realize that we are body, soul creatures and that our physical can affect our spiritual, and our spiritual can affect our physical. However, by and large, a lot of what science says about depression is largely because of how they have to understand it. Because they can't address the soul, they have to make it purely natural. And so if you are someone who's like me and you had a doctor sit down and say, okay, I hear that you are feeling this sadness and this emptiness and this detachment. And for me, when I was a lot younger, I was hurting myself because I felt so empty that I wanted to feel something. My doctor said, okay, you have a chemical imbalance. No tests were done. Doctor just said I had a chemical imbalance. And so I was treated as though it was a natural cause without actually being able to see that it was a natural problem. And so, again, I recognize that there are some people who genuinely might have physical problems creating their depression, but I want to be really careful that we don't just immediately write that off and say, oh no, it's just physical, I can't help it. Because like I said, for the vast majority of people, and if you're sitting there saying, not me, I'm going to guess, probably you too. Depression is showing you that there is a problem deep in your heart. Now, Jesus Christ casts this idea as a tree. Your depression is a fruit that is growing naturally from whatever tree that it's attached to. So I get this from Luke chapter 6, verse 43 to 45. For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. So in other words, what Christ is saying is that what we see growing is a sign of what that tree is, right? When you go by a tree and you see apples growing from it, you immediately know that this started from the seed of an apple tree, and it grew into an apple tree, and therefore it naturally produced apples. So too with depression. If we are experiencing depression, there's a good chance that's actually just a fruit that is growing out of something in our hearts. That there is something that we have been participating in, something that we are believing, something that we are refusing to do. And because of that, we are experiencing these different feelings that are going to be just natural byproducts of what's going on deep down. Now, one thing I want to be really clear about is that a lot of times we can be very black and white and say, oh, only evil people are going to have only evil fruits, and only good people are only going to have good fruits. But if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you know that you have this constant struggle of the new man and the old man, right? Of, as Galatians 5 says, the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. And so if you are someone experiencing depression, or let's make it personal, when I am experiencing depression, it's not because my whole being is evil and in rebellion against God, but because there is an area of my life that is in rebellion, that area is blossoming into a natural work, a natural thought, a natural behavior, a natural feeling, right? But in other areas where I am being faithful, those likewise will produce good fruits, good thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. And so I want us to be really clear that this isn't some kind of beat up thing of you're just a terrible person because you experienced this. Again, I can be very personal about this. And I know that when I'm experiencing depression, it's not that I have completely abandoned the faith and I've lost my salvation or I never had it in the first place. But instead, when I'm experiencing depression, I'm realizing this is a fruit. And then I want to trace the fruit to its branch, to the trunk, and all the way down to the roots so that I can see where is this coming from? Right? What is in my heart right now that is producing this? And I would say, as long as I'm willing to be honest, 10 times out of 10, I can trace it. Now, the question, as we'll discuss later, becomes, what am I going to do about it? But broadly speaking, as I transition into this next part, I just want us to understand that when we are seeing a bad fruit, right, when we're seeing wrong actions, thoughts, feelings, those are coming from somewhere, right? We want to trace it down to the root. We don't want to just take care of that fruit, of those symptoms. That can be fine, right? There's nothing wrong with desiring relief. But if that's all we're doing, we're completely missing the whole point, which is to say, where is this coming from? So that we can, uproot the bad tree and plant something better in its place. So what can be the roots of depression? As we are analyzing, as we are thinking through our life, what are some things that we could look at that might help us answer where this could be coming from? Now, I'm going to go through, like a 12, 15 item list that I have just kind of brainstormed, but please understand, for every individual feeling of hopelessness, there could be thousands of reasons why it's there. That's why as believers, we need to have God's word be our authority so that we can rightly examine ourselves and see what's truly going on in our hearts, no matter how uncomfortable it is. So what can be some of the roots of depression? What have I been able to brainstorm? One could just be flat out spiritual laziness. I don't want to read my Bible. I don't want to pray. I don't want to go to church. I don't want to just think about godly things or invest in my local body. I don't want to train my children the way God wants me to. I don't want to treat my spouse in the way that God tells me to. I just want to kind of go along and just not do those things I know I should. It could be worry. I feel powerless to stop this. Why would that not produce hopelessness in us? If we feel like there is some terrible thing that is inevitable and we are powerless to stop it, one, it shows what our hope is in, which is the outcome of a situation, and it shows us that we are putting our hope in ourselves, and so we feel hopeless because we are powerless. It could just be living like the world. I told you I had struggled with depression and suicide for 20 years before this whole thing started, and I've shared kind of my whole journey there, but ultimately, my biggest issue then is, by and large, my issue today, and that is whenever I felt or still feel depressed, it's because in some way I am living or thinking like the world. Despite what James warns me about, despite what Peter warns me about, despite what, Genesis to Revelation warns me about thinking like the world, embracing worldliness, right? Taking my eyes off God, not wanting to be holy as he is holy. Despite all that stuff, in my sin, I still want to have just a little taste of the world. Just think a little bit like the world. Try to find happiness in the way that the world says I can find happiness. And by and large, unless God is merciful and immediately cutting that is going to grow into depression for me. Now, another root might be guilt or shame. It can be actual guilt or shame, guilt being that you have done something wrong, shame being more of your identity, and there can also be false ones that will lead to depression as well. And that's where we want to be really careful with stuff like guilt. I think a classic example of that is someone who has been a victim of abuse. I think especially children who have been victims of abuse, and they feel guilty because they made this person do this thing, or they feel like they are terrible people because of what was done to them. And so they can spiral off into feelings of depression because they falsely understand what guilt and shame is, and they think that they have done something wrong. And because of just that even a misunderstanding about truth builds into a lifetime of depression for them. Now, another thing that can lead to it is just unconfessed sin. You think of what David said, where his bones wasted away because of his unconfessed sin. It can be entitlement towards comfort or relief, saying, I deserve to have this. I deserve to feel better. I deserve to have a spouse or a job that I like, or money or kids or whatever it is, respect from people. And so when we put our hope in that thing and we don't get it, we lose hope. We feel frustrated because we say, if I just had this thing, I would be happy. I'm putting all my hope in this thing and I can't get it. Or flip side, we do get that thing. This thing that we've put all our hopes in. God, in his disciplining love, gives us the idol of our heart, and we get it, and it turns to ash in our mouth. And so that thing that we trusted in for happiness and identity and satisfaction is not what it was supposed to be. And so once again, we are left with hopelessness, despair, a feeling of emptiness because there's just nothing in the world that works and is satisfying and fulfilling. We could be stewing in bitterness, and we can just be rehearsing, all our anger and frustration at a person, and they can just become this supervillain in our mind. And especially if something good happens to that person, we can get so despondent, right, and sorrowful, because how can God give them this thing? Doesn't he know how horrible I've built them up in my mind? We can be depressed from a fear of man or from people pleasing, which again is that kind of entitlement comfort thing I just said. I need this person's respect. I need people to like me. I need people to think I'm intelligent or beautiful or successful. And I'm not getting that. And I feel like a failure. Or I do get that and it's still not enough. And so I need to work harder. I need to do better. I need to be more impressive. And so we're putting our hope in these things and in people and saying, these people are going to be my satisfaction. They won't fail me. And so the belief and the hope and the trust that we're supposed to have in God alone, we put in his image bearers. We put it in imperfect people who are just as sinful and wretched as we are. Maybe even worse, because sometimes we think that unbelievers are going to be our source of satisfaction. People who aren't even filled with the Spirit of God, who haven't been redeemed by the blood of Christ. We think they are going to be the ones to make us feel better and give us satisfaction and hope in this life. Now, another way that we can be depressed, and again, this is kind of like that feeling false guilt thing, is we can be frustrated because we feel like we're trying to do the right thing and we're not getting the results we want. And so we'll say things like, God, I am doing all that I'm supposed to do. Why am I still feeling this way? Why am I still not successful? Why am I still not married? And if we can analyze ourselves, what we're really saying is, God, I have done the right things. You now owe me. You need to pay up. And so we get depressed because this thing that we're putting our hope in, which is a result, isn't satisfying us because we're doing the quote unquote right thing, but with the wrong heart behind it. Another thing is our pride and feeling like a failure. One nasty part of depression is that if you feel like you should not be depressed, you can be like David and say, why is my soul downcast? But instead of responding like David did, where he said, I'll put my hope and trust in the Lord, we say, I should be stronger than this. I need to do better. And then we don't do better. We fail to make ourselves feel better. We fail to pick ourselves up. And so we get more depressed. And we say, okay, why am I downcast? I need to try harder. And on and on and on and on it goes. And it will never end. I guarantee it. Until we humble ourselves before the Lord. Now, where does a lot of this stuff come from? What is the source behind this? I've kind of hinted at it, but just to state it really clearly, as you are analyzing your own roots of depression, why do you feel the way you feel? Where is this coming from? It is going to be because you lack trust in God, because God has said to do something or not do something, and you don't trust him with that. And so you want to go your own way. You want to hedge your bets. You want to put a little faith in God, but also a little faith in this other thing, just in case God doesn't come through. Or, very much attached to this, you are just flat out putting your hope and satisfaction in the wrong thing. Right? As you analyze it, that's a lot of what you're going to find. All those are the common threads, is a lack of trust in God and putting false hope and satisfaction in other things. Now, like I said, that's just a sampling. There are different roots that can produce these feelings of hopelessness, but that is a tool that I want to give you to help you think through the feelings of depression you're having. Now, as we apply that to pain and suffering, what was I doing? With the story that I told you, the things that were happening to me. I was putting a lot of my hope and trust in my identity as a man, as a provider, as a father and husband, as a churchgoer, as a teacher, as someone who doesn't need help, as someone who wants to be healthy, right? All these identity things that I had were failing me. And so I was feeling hopeless because that's not who I'm supposed to be. That's not who I am. That's not who I want to be. I was putting my hope in saying, I would trust God more. I would love God more if he would take this away from me. Or I would say, I don't deserve to hurt like this. I don't deserve this. I deserve better. I don't want this. I can't be happy if I feel like this. And I didn't share this before, but you could probably guess my spiritual practices dropped as well. My Bible reading became either very focused on relief things and wanting to just read and interpret scripture through my own suffering, or I just wouldn't do it at all. Which, if you've ever suffered at all, whether it's a cold or whether it's 6 months of suffering, you know that you just don't want to do the things. And so in all of those, though, and in any time I've experienced depression in the past or today, in all of those, the common thread is I am either not trusting God and being who he is and doing what he said he would do, or I'm putting my hope in something that is going to fail me. My identity, my feelings, my experiences, money, the opinions of others, right? I'm saying these things will satisfy me as long as they come through. And whether or not I get them, it's never enough because those things are never meant to satisfy. They're not meant to be the thing that I trust in for hope and joy. And now, again, you might be listening to this, and I know that the depression, especially those who experience it, it is a controversial thing, and people don't like being challenged on what they've experienced. And so another natural response to this now is, no, you don't understand. I'm depressed because of something that happened to me. And so it's not my fault. Again, removing ourselves even from the biology one, which again is not remotely as accurate as science wants us to believe, or so-called science. A lot of times we want to say, well, it's not my fault that I'm depressed. In the same way, we might want to say, it's not my fault I got angry. My coworker did it. That Yahoo in traffic made me angry. My kids made me angry. My spouse made me angry. My dog made me angry. What do we do when we say that? We refuse to accept responsibility for something negative in our lives. And if that was true, fine. Right? Like that's, we don't want to say, well, I stepped off the chair and I fell to the ground. Gravity made me do it. It's not my fault. Like, yeah, if there is a natural force, absolutely, that we are powerless against, we don't want to take blame for it. But depression is usually not like that. We can't blame our circumstances because our circumstances don't cause depression. Now, this is really important. Your circumstances, my circumstances, all the stuff that was happening to me with my pain, all the stuff that still happens to me, is not why I'm depressed. It's revealing what's already there. So we don't get depressed because we lost a job or we're struggling financially. We don't get depressed because we broke up with our boyfriend or girlfriend, or we've lost a loved one, or because we feel overwhelmed. I don't get depressed because I suffer from nonstop chronic pain. Do not mishear me. These things are hard. They are miserable. Especially losing a loved one. I don't want anyone to experience that. But they are not the cause of our depression. Those things are agitators. They put pressure on us and reveal what's been there lying dormant. So think of your circumstances and your depression or whatever, your anger. Again, this stuff is broadly applicable because this is just kind of biblical counseling 101. Think of your heart like a sponge. Now, if you just have a sponge sitting there on the sink, it can look just fine. It could be dry. It could have water in it. It could have rotten milk. It could have, pick your nasty thing. When the sponge is just sitting there, you don't always necessarily know what is inside of it. But how do we find out? When is the contents of a sponge revealed? Whenever we put pressure on it. Whenever we squeeze it, right? We can squeeze it lightly and we'll get a little hint of what's really there. And we might know the contents, but we may not know how much is really inside that sponge. But the greater the pressure that is applied on that sponge, the more of its contents are going to be revealed. In your heart, my heart is the exact same way. I can be going through life and things can be hunky-dory, sunshine and rainbows. I might be putting my trust in my circumstances, in money, in my spouse being my all-satisfying person, in the opinions of others making me feel good. And I may not realize how much I'm walking in sin and in self-reliance and in putting my hope in the wrong things and not trusting God. I may be completely unaware of just how much I'm doing that. But as soon as my wife's having a rough day and might be in a bit of a bad mood or might be, just not as perky as normal, which if you know my wife, it's weird. Normally, though, pretty perky and it's awesome. But there are times where she is not, my bright spot of sunshine. There are times where people don't think well of me. There are times where no matter how used to my pain I am, there are hard days. And that's that little bit of pressure that can start revealing what's in my heart. Am I responding with love and patience and joy and trusting in God? Am I fleeing to my refuge? Or am I seeking distraction on my phone and wanting to just ignore things? Or spiraling into depression or anxiety or fear or anger? Whatever happens, it's simply revealing what's already in my heart. Those circumstances, those negative things aren't the reason I'm feeling the way I'm feeling or responding the way that I'm responding. They're just exposing what's already down in there. And then when things get really bad, that's that big squeeze on the sponge. And that can really show what's in my heart. Now, I don't want to take this super negative, nor do I want to toot my own horn, but I just want to share an example of what this can look like in a positive way. So this is Thursday. On Saturday night, so last Saturday night, I slept about 2 hours. It was a really rough and painful night. I'd had a big activity with the student ministries where I'm a teacher, and I didn't do anything crazy, but just with my body being the way it is, just any activity is usually going to cause me difficulty. And so that night, I didn't sleep well. 2 hours, not great. I'm happy if I can get 4. I'm really happy if I can get 6, but 2, fine. So the next day at church and through all that, I was kind of tired. I was a little run down. And so that night, I'm like, all right, I'm going to sleep great tonight because I'm running on 2 hours of sleep. And that night, I slept 45 minutes. Everything in my body was just screaming at me through the night. I fell asleep at I don't even know, sometime around midnight. I can't remember. Woke up shortly after, and I just could not get back to sleep no matter what I did. Tried all the things that typically can help me get at least a little bit distracted from my pain enough to fall asleep. Didn't happen. So in the course of 2 nights of sleep, I was running on less than 3 hours of sleep. And I entered into that Monday like, all right, I am tired. God, I need you. I knew what I was going to be like. I knew what my history was. I knew how my heart could respond. And so I just immediately surrendered to God. And I was a little bit of a zombie. but I just had to thank God for how that day went. I was patient with my kids. I was able to interact well with other people. I was able to even get some work done and things like that. I was able to live that day fairly faithfully to my Lord, despite that pressure being put on me. And again, that's not to toot my own horn, because by and large, when I get that squeeze, it shows that there's something ugly in my heart. But understanding this, right, that these roots that we have produce certain fruits, that we are like sponges, it doesn't always have to be negative, because Christ said, right, a good person out of the goodness of his heart produces good fruit. And so it is possible to experience these circumstances and be able to turn around and praise God and say, God, thank you for the work you've done in me. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for being my sufficient strength in this situation. So again, all that to say, though, that there are times where I could have gotten 45 minutes of sleep and just been an absolute nightmare to be around. And it probably would have been good for my wife just to take the kids to play at the park for a while, just to get away from me. But that same circumstance, that same situation that could have made me angry, depressed, frustrated, allowed me to glorify God even more. Because as I said, circumstances don't cause depression. They reveal what's already there. They can reveal a love and a trust in God, or they can reveal that we're putting our hope in wrong things, that we are not trusting God and what he has revealed in his word. So what do we do about it? Okay, we've identified the fruits. Maybe you're on board with me in seeing that depression's not our greatest problem, but that it's like the pain of an infection. It's unpleasant, but it's not the deepest issue. It's not what's really killing us. So how do we kill these bad roots that are producing bad fruits? Well, in my experience, it's not easy, and it's definitely not fun. I would much rather blame it on the brain, which is funny to like the one of you that knows that that's a joke about a biblical counseling book by Ed Welch. But I can blame it on my brain and say I can't help it. I can try to alleviate my symptoms. I can get distracted. I could take medications. Maybe not me, because meds don't touch fibromyalgia, but if there was a medication, or, in your case, if you're just dealing with depression, yeah, you could just take an antidepressant to feel better, and that would remove the pain of the infection. We could cover over it by trying to feel better about ourselves. There are plenty of people on YouTube and in the podcast sphere who will gladly help you feel better about yourself, say that things aren't your fault, say that you can't help it, say that, just remember that God loves you and you're awesome. We could use other things to suppress how we feel, drugs, alcohol, whatever. There's lots of things we can do to feel better, and those are easier to do. They might be more destructive, but it's easier. Almost anything is easier than saying, here is something I am feeling or doing. What have I done to produce this fruit in my life? What kind of seed have I planted without even realizing it that is producing this? And so, like I said, if we want to kill these bad roots, right? If we want to squeeze out that nasty sponge, bleach it, maybe set it on fire and get a new one, and fill it with good things, right? How can we put off these sinful things and put on better things? Like I said, for me, 2 questions. Where am I not putting my trust in God? With my experience, as I shared, thought God had abandoned me. I had false hopes about, or I thought that God had given me false hope about my desires for serving at my church. And I thought that he had told me that I was a different person than what I thought I was. I was questioning his sovereignty. I was questioning his goodness. I was realizing that he wasn't all I needed, right? I wasn't trusting that God was sufficient for me. And then I ask, where am I putting my hope in the wrong things? And for me, I was putting my hope in my identity, which was being threatened. I was worried about what others thought of my difficulties and my thoughts. I wouldn't tell people that I was struggling with depression. I was putting my hope in distractions, which weren't working. I was putting my hope in happiness and saying, I need to be happy and I can't be happy because of how I feel. I was putting my hope in getting what I thought I deserved, and I definitely was such a good person that I did not deserve to feel the pain that I was feeling. And I was putting my hope in a false understanding of God's justice, because there was times where I would say, God, why am I suffering? This guy is worse than me. He's not leading his family well. He's not faithful to his wife. Why does he get to have a good life? Because I was putting my hope in how I was determining and defining what a good life was. So in a way, as I said at the beginning, in a way, I've learned to be thankful for my depression because it's become a way that God loves me. So Hebrews chapter 12, verses 6 through 8 say, "For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives." And then verse 11 says, "For the moment, all discipline," right? All of our Father's discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So how does God discipline me? How is depression actually a good, if I can say that, a good thing? Because sometimes God lets me have the empty idols that I crave. He allows me to just spiral down into foolish thinking and in putting my hope and trust in worldly things and in worldly thinking. And then when those things don't satisfy me, either because I think I need them and I never get them, and then he corrects me, or I think I need things, I think I need comfort, happiness, distraction, whatever, and I get them, and it still isn't enough, or it doesn't last long enough, then God is always right there to restore me and to allow me to walk in full surrender to him, right? To repent of those evil thoughts, evil assumptions, evil idols that I had, laying them at the foot of the cross, repenting and saying, God, no, I want you. I see my need for you. And going through the painfulness of removing those roots, right? Removing those evil things I was putting my hope and satisfaction in and replacing it with godly things. Putting my hope in the Lord and what he has said and what he has revealed. And again, that is, to me, for my life, for my experience, for the constant ways that God is always restoring me back to him, that is such a good thing. Because what if I held that sin in my heart and God did not put pressure on me? What if he did not allow me to examine the fruits that were growing in the things that I was doing and the things that I was believing? That sin would still be there. I would still be walking in sin. I just wouldn't recognize it because I wouldn't be responding. I wouldn't have that pain of that infection deep in my soul to tell me that there was something deeply wrong that needed to be addressed immediately. Now, again, I want to remind you, not everyone is going to experience depression by harboring sin. You might harbor sin. You might put your hope in the wrong things. You might have ways that you think and behave like the world and not respond in depression. You might respond in anger or pride or whatever. And again, it is possible, I want to be very clear, it is possible that there is something genuinely wrong with your brain that just causes these emotional feelings, even though they aren't based on anything. But don't just run to that and cling to that and say, oh, I don't need to examine myself. I don't need to get rid of sin in my life. I can blame it on my brain. Because my doctor told me he can't show me anything on a scan. There hasn't been any blood work or anything done to really prove it. When we do that, when we say, well, my doctor just told me I have this, and he gave me antidepressants and told me that, I just have, for me, my doctor told me I had severe depression and dysthymia, which I don't know what the modern terms are now. I think they call it double depression, but effectively I was medically diagnosed by having a constant low-grade depression as well as like really severe dips. But again, there was no exams done. There was no genuine test done. I was just handed a label saying, here is what you have. Here's what's wrong with you. Take this to feel better. And so many people feel trapped in their depression or in any of their psychological diagnoses because they were just told they had a thing based on how they told a doctor they were feeling. But really think about that. Let's go back to our infection metaphor. If you went to a doctor and said, my toe is throbbing, and your doctor said, that sounds like a deep infection in the bone. We need to amputate immediately to protect the rest of your foot. And the doctor didn't even look at it, ran no test, did absolutely nothing, just listened to your words and your feelings and told you, here's what is biologically wrong with you. You would slap that doctor. And yet, we will take that same thing and say, well, my doctor listened to my symptoms, or a psychologist or psychiatrist or a Christian counselor, they listened to my symptoms and gave me this label and said, here is what is biologically wrong with you. And we just accept it. And then we are trapped because we can't help it. And as I hope I have clearly laid out, one of the deepest problems that causes isn't just that we feel stuck, but that we never have to examine our hearts. We just keep dealing with depression, or we smother the depression with medications or self-help techniques or modifying our behavior, but then it just pops up elsewhere. We're not treating the infection. We're just treating the symptoms with medication and counseling and therapy and things like that. So try to take this seriously as you're thinking through your own depression, as you are walking alongside someone. If you're walking alongside someone, be very careful how you approach this, because seriously, one of the most unhelpful things you can say is, oh, you're depressed? Pray. Trust the Lord. Do better. Like, that's not helpful. That is not what it looks like to sit beside someone suffering true, genuine emotional pain and lovingly saying, I don't want you to sit in this. I want better for you. And then doing the loving things necessary to actually bring them genuine healing. Part of that is, we'll talk next time, part of that is, yes, dealing with the pain of that infection, but not being satisfied to stop there. Because we got to get that infection out. We've got to uproot those bad trees that produce bad fruit. And not just get rid of them, but replace them with good fruit, and which can only be found by placing good trees, good roots that are rooted in the cross. So to summarize this part on depression, and we'll get into suicide, but suicide is not going to be as long. But to just kind of summarize this whole section on depression. Not all feelings of depression are caused by sin, right? We live in a sin-cursed world. It can affect our biology. We just want to be careful about what we accept with that. And also remember that your depression or other people's depression, it's a collection of things. So when we're analyzing it, when we're talking to people about it, get at what depression means to us. If we are hopeless, it's because we are putting our hope in something that's failing us, right? If our hope is fully in God, God can't fail. So we don't have a reason to be hopeless. So analyze that. If someone is feeling empty, what are they looking towards for satisfaction that's not filling them? If someone is just feeling sorrow, maybe feelings of depression that they're experiencing aren't negative. Maybe it's not bad. We live in a broken world. Sometimes we're going to feel sorrow. When we lose a loved one, we as people, we weren't meant to actually experience death. You think of the garden, you think of Genesis 1 and 2, death only came after sin. So we as humans, we aren't meant to actually experience and be confronted with the death of other humans. So it's natural to feel deep sorrow that can last a long time. So just overall, just be very careful, but be very honest in thinking about depression. And remember just to think about it like the pain from an infection. Our goal is not to silence the things that we don't like, but to use it to realize that there is a problem that we do need to take care of. Now, let's talk about suicide. Again, very painful subject. And if you have had someone in your life that has committed suicide, I know this is a painful topic to revisit and open up. You are not required to listen to this. if it's painful, if it's something you're currently struggling with, again, best thing I can tell you is I might be able to offer you some wisdom, but you need someone, your pastor or a mature believer from your church or in your life that can walk alongside you and walk through these things with you. If you don't have that, again, I will have a link down in the show notes where you can connect to somebody near you who can walk you through it. But I want us to just think about what suicide is about, right? So having understood that depression, to a certain degree, is us failing to find happiness and satisfaction in the wrong things. Why would someone want to end their life? So again, very brief, very honest. Suicide is a desire to take happiness into our own hands. A lot of people think, oh, it's an escape. They can't deal with life. They're too weak, whatever. No. Anytime suicide has even remotely crossed my mind, it's because in my current moment, I am not as happy as I want to be. And suicide is a potential answer to that lack of happiness. It is my way of saying, God won't bring me relief, so I'll go and get it myself. Suicide is a way of me saving myself from something that I think I need salvation from. So one thing, a quote that radically transformed my life, right? As I was dealing with depression and thoughts of suicide, I was, of all things, studying theology, and I ran across this quote from Blaise Pascal. And he wasn't talking about suicide at the time, but his final note that he says just really clarified and helped me to truly understand what depression and especially suicide are all about. So I'm going to read you the quote. He says, "All men seek happiness. This is without exception. Whatever different means they employ, they all tend to this end. The cause of some going to war and others avoiding it is the same desire in both, attended with different views." So in other words, what he's saying is that everything we do is built on us seeking some form of happiness. Why do some people sign up for the army to go to war, and why do some people refuse to join the army? Ultimately, because they are seeking something they think will make them happy and bring them satisfaction. So, continuing the quote, "The will never takes the least step but to this object. This is the motive of every action of every man, even those who hang themselves." So, Blaise Pascal very rightly points out that everything we do, even self-destruction, is an attempt to find happiness on our own terms. And so you have people who say, suicide's not the answer. And they are absolutely right. Suicide is never the answer because it's trying to deal with the wrong question. Suicide is saying, I can find no other way to be happy or to end my unhappiness. But as I've talked about with this series, right, our goal in life isn't to escape pain, even deep pain, whether physical pain or emotional pain. Our goal in life is not the pursuit of happiness. As I said in episode 1, God doesn't command us to be healthy. And I'll add to that, God doesn't command us to be happy, but he does command us to be holy. And suicide is just an evidence, or thoughts of suicide. Whenever I am thinking about suicide, that is my sign that I am seeking the wrong things in life. I am seeking happiness. I am not attaining happiness in the way that I think I should, or the way that I want to. And so if I can't get it, then I can at least end my unhappiness. And that, in its way, will be a form of happiness. So remember, I'm not saying this like some kind of theory, like someone who never has any problems in their life, doesn't know what this is about. I say it as someone who still struggles with depression and thoughts of suicide. Now, legal stuff, blah, 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 I need to be clear. I'm never going to act on these thoughts, okay? It has been over a decade, well over a decade, 20 years probably, since I've had any real attempts at it. So just being really clear, okay, this isn't some weird, like, you need to be worried about me thing. And I'll explain why I still have them in a moment. Or if I forget, I'll explain it next episode. But anyway, it is not an actual option for me. I'm sharing my experience. I'm being very open. Maybe uncomfortably open, but whatever. That's how I roll. But I want to be open because it's important to me that Christians don't hide these battles. I spent way too long hiding my depression and my struggles. And so I suffered because I was not taking hold of the means that God had put in my life in the form of other believers and them coming alongside me to walk through these difficulties. So we need to bring these problems and these struggles into the light. We need to expose them to the truth of the Bible and expose them to other believers who can likewise help us expose the truth of the Bible to them so that we can rightly analyze the source of these feelings and these thoughts so that we can take them captive to Christ. And so that we and even those who come alongside us can glorify God because we honestly wanted to deal with our sin more than we wanted to hide in our shame. So, like I said, I still struggle with these things, not as often, and I think that if you've been listening to this episode, you can understand why. The more that I'm able to be honest, the more that I'm able to recognize just that little bit of liquid coming out of the sponge when pressure is applied, the faster that I can say, oh, there's a bad fruit. Let's go kill the root. But depression and thoughts of suicide, I have found are very similar to things like divorce, cheating on your diet, or skipping class. Now, it sounds really weird, but really think about those things. Once you've been divorced, you are much more likely to get divorced again. The first time you cheat on your diet, you can go 2 years on a really great strict diet, and you're like, just this once. How long until you cheat on that diet again? 6 months? A day? Right? Same with skipping class. You could skip class once and get away with it, and maybe you would never do it again. Maybe you would never get divorced again. But that option is just there. You've opened the door. You've realized, hey, this is a reality. This is a thing that could actually be an option. And so it can always just be a what if in the back of your mind when dealing with something difficult, like living with chronic pain or depression. So if you're listening to this and suicide has crossed your mind, again, as I've been very clear on, it's not a solution. If you want to really treat the pain that you're experiencing, then the important thing is to get help from others so that you can get at the infection that's causing that pain. Go back to those 2 questions. Where am I not trusting God? Where am I putting my hope in the wrong things? And again, I'm going to keep reiterating it because depression and especially thoughts of suicide are incredibly isolating things. And so it is really, really tempting to just go at it on our own, to be ashamed, to not want to bother people, to minimize it and feel like it's not a big deal. No. Get someone involved. Contact your pastor, a mature Christian, check the links down in the notes. Find someone who will walk beside you through this painful time. Find someone who won't just help you to stay alive one more day, but will help you to fight the lies that you're believing and the doubts that you have and help you replace them with the truth. So to wrap up this episode, remember that depression isn't your problem. It's a warning. It's that pain from an infection. It's something that God can use to show us something festering in our hearts. But even when we start killing those sinful roots, that pain's not always going to immediately disappear. And it's not guaranteed to stay away forever. And so in the next episode, I'm going to focus on how to address things like hopelessness and despair biblically so that you can walk through them with endurance. So now that you know how to kill those bad roots and start replacing them, we're going to talk about how to deal with those fruits that might linger for days or weeks or even months. So I hope that this discussion has been helpful to you. I hope that it's helped orient you to a more biblical way of thinking, of understanding the truth of your heart and how much power your beliefs and where you place your hope and your trust has in your life. I hope that you've been encouraged, that you are not stuck, that you are not just a victim, but that even though it's hard and painful and unpleasant, that you feel like you better understand how to deal with these thoughts in your life or in the lives of others. So as always, thank you to those of you on Patreon who support Onward in the Faith and help me cover the various costs associated with this. If you want to join them in supporting me, links will be down in the show notes. But Lord willing, I will see you all next time.